So thank you for coming to our mental health session, which is all about mental health and co-occurring conditions for autism. So I'm Bethan, I'm one of the chairs for this session. And then the other chair for the session is Freya, who you should be able to see next to me. Hey Freya. So the general points for this session are obviously, please be nice to each other. We can disagree, but disagree in a way which is nice and not personal. We've got our Twitter hashtag for anyone who wants to join in discussion on Twitter, or obviously visit it afterwards if you can't multitask. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, we've got a Q&A button. This is how, if you've got any questions or points you want to make, just type it in here and we will answer them for you. All delegates are muted, so hopefully the only people you can hear are us panelists when we're talking. And this will be recorded, so we'll share it with subtitles after the festival is over. Thank you. Freya, do you want to?
Unmuted myself. I am Freya. I'm co-hosting with Bethan. I'm autistic, and I was diagnosed when I was 14 after my mental health became really poor, which is common for a lot of people to receive diagnosis kind of after mental health problems have become apparent. And I still have mental health problems. Remember that the benefit of a virtual festival, research conference festival, is that you can quite literally unplug and come back later. So if some of the topics are things that you know might be upsetting for you, or something that actually you're really not in a place to listen to right now, remember that these are recorded, so you aren't missing anything. You can come back and watch these another time. And you know, you can go on TikTok, which has been my latest hole that I've fallen into on the internet, or whatever you enjoy doing. Make a cup of tea, all of those things. So remember that primarily it's about looking after your mental health, and that the research and these sessions will be there later if you need to take a break. I think that's everything I have to say.
Brilliant, thank you, Freya. And yeah, just a reminder, we'll have links in the chat at any point if anyone's talking about anything. Oh, that was it. And we'll have Q&As. Instead of having Q&As after each individual speaker, we will have them in 2 batches, in the middle and at the end of a session. So please submit your Q&As, and if you want to ask someone directly, put their name by them, be really helpful. Brilliant. So we'll move on to our first speaker for the session, who is Katie, who is a postgraduate researcher at Newcastle. And Katie will be talking about the impact of trauma and psychosocial stress on autistic people.
Hello, is this working?
Yep, we can see that.
Excellent, brilliant. I'm not very experienced at doing this yet. Okay, so, right. Okay, so my talk is a little, my discussion topic has got a little bit more specific since I submitted my proposal, because that was just after I'd finished collecting data. So I'm going to be presenting my findings on a measure I used to look at complex post-traumatic stress disorder in my first study of my PhD that I'm doing at Newcastle, and my supervisors are Jackie Rogers, Sarah Cassidy and Magda Glod. So the background to this is actually a pretty easy rationale to write as studies go, because it's all very common sense. So previous research has found that post-traumatic stress disorder might be more common in autistic people than in the general population. And being traumatized seems to be related to poor mental health, unsurprisingly, and risk of suicide. So complex PTSD is going to be a new addition in the next diagnostic manual used in Europe for diagnosing mental health disorders. And it's kind of a variant on post-traumatic stress disorder. So it includes all of the core features of PTSD, which is things like flashbacks, avoidance of triggers, hypervigilance. And then it includes a whole host of other symptoms which are unique to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is like dysregulated mood, unstable emotions, poor self-esteem, and relationship difficulties. Some researchers think that complex post-traumatic stress might be more common than PTSD because it's linked to like repeated interpersonal trauma that autistic people are particularly vulnerable to, things like bullying and abuse. And there are also some similarities between some autistic traits and some symptoms of PTSD, complex PTSD. So things like hypervigilance, that can be kind of confused for sensory sensitivities. It can contribute to sensory sensitivities as well. Dysregulated mood and things like meltdowns are quite they can look quite similar. Avoidance is sometimes quite a common coping strategy for autistic people. So there's a whole load of kind of crossovers. So what I did is I did a big online study last year. I did 8 questionnaires. So I'm presenting data here from the International Trauma Questionnaire, which measures PTSD and complex PTSD, and that has like a diagnostic algorithm in it. So you can look at people's responses to the questions, and you can say, well, it's quite likely that these people would be above the threshold for being diagnosed with complex PTSD. These people might meet the criteria for PTSD, and these people probably wouldn't meet any of those diagnostic criteria. I looked at the vulnerability experiences quotient, which is a list of stressful and traumatic events, and the shorter form of the AQ, which measures autistic traits. So I had 260 participants. I stated on the advert that you don't need a history of traumatic events to participate, because I wanted to get responses from a wide range of people. I wanted to be able to compare people who hadn't experienced a lot of trauma to people who had experienced a lot, had formal diagnosis of an autism spectrum condition, or adults, and it was all online. So all the questionnaires were done for an online survey. Quite a good range of ages. I had a very weird gender ratio. It's not that weird, I guess, for online research. So it's quite common for more women than men to take part in online research, but I had far more non-binary people than men as well. So that's something that I'm going to have to address in future research. It doesn't look like men really wanted to take part in my study. So the results, like a lot of my participants, half of my participants looked like they were going to meet the threshold for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's a huge number of participants. Another 11% met the threshold for just PTSD, and most of them would have met the threshold for complex PTSD, except their self-esteem was too good. That was the most common question that got missed out of the diagnostic criteria, the ones where they were talking about like negative self-concept, the symptom clusters called. So nearly 40% of the participants didn't meet the threshold for any diagnosis, but again, nearly half of those only missed the PTSD diagnosis by one question, which was about like the impact of symptoms on their daily life. So a lot of them were experiencing PTSD symptoms, but they didn't feel like it had a huge impact on their life. The table there is the kind of overall endorsement. So that's the whole group of participants together. And you can see that there's like, it was very common. Everyone in my sample had an awful lot of difficulties congruent with these symptoms. So I also looked to whether the VEQ and the AQ came in. I looked at whether there were differences between the diagnostic groups, between how many traumatic or stressful events had been experienced. So the group that could probably be diagnosed with complex PTSD had experienced significantly more events than the other two groups. And I also looked at the same thing with autistic traits. So again, the complex PTSD group self-reported more autistic traits than the other two groups as well. So that's my table broken down by diagnosis. So this is the first study that looked at complex PTSD rather than just PTSD. There's been a bit of research into PTSD now in autistic people. And it's found that PTSD is very common, but because complex PTSD is a new diagnosis, no one's really looked at it yet. And when I looked at studies that had already investigated complex PTSD in other populations, the percentage of participants that could probably be diagnosed with it was more in line with the sort of percentages you'd see in studies looking at participants who'd already been traumatized and were looking for trauma-related therapy rather than kind of general population samples. So in the general population, complex PTSD can be found in like 3 to 5% of the population, whereas in treatment-seeking samples, it's usually somewhere between 40 and 70%. PTSD on its own was much less common in my sample, and that, you know, I think that suggests that more attention to complex PTSD is warranted, because there's clearly something going on there. The diagnosis, or at least probably meeting the diagnostic criteria, was related to both cumulative exposure to trauma and to autistic traits. And the autistic traits is an interesting finding because there has been one other study that checked that out in relation to PTSD and found that there wasn't any relationship. So there's a few different possible explanations for that. Could be the questionnaires. It might just be that the AQ and the ITQ kind of measure similar things. But I kind of looked at that statistically. It doesn't seem to be the case. They're not like unduly like related. It might be that this was a difficult thing to word. So I guess the number of items on the AQ that someone ticks, the level of autistic traits they experience. Maybe if you have more autistic traits according to the AQ, maybe that makes you more vulnerable to experiencing trauma. That's another potential possibility, because it's cumulative and repeated trauma that increases risk of complex PTSD rather than single events. So that's a possible explanation. And a final explanation might be that experiencing trauma might increase autistic traits, which is quite controversial, but there's a bit of evidence to back that up as well. Complex PTSD has been related to things like sensory sensitivities, and as I said, relationship difficulties, social difficulties is one of the core symptoms. So it's possible that if you have autistic traits and then you experience trauma and that makes you quite scared of people and even more confused of people, then you might, as a kind of byproduct, tick more items on something like the AQ. So that's another explanation. This was a very preliminary study. It's the first study of my PhD, so I was kind of figuring stuff out as I went along. Self-report questionnaires are quite, they're not the most reliable method of diagnosis. So it would be really good if this could be repeated in a clinical setting with clinical interviews to properly diagnose complex PTSD, to see how common it really is. It would be interesting to do it, again, I guess different recruitment strategies is kind of related to that. So there might be something about posting adverts on social media. I think lots of people would have been attracted to the study because they experienced trauma. So despite the fact that I put that in my advert, I kind of suspected that I'd have a lot of people who are specifically interested in the topic. I think it would also be quite interesting to look at differences in terms of autistic traits, whether there are differences in terms of whether someone had experienced trauma in childhood versus adulthood. And yeah, no, that's about it actually, I think. So, references. Cool. Right.
Thanks, Katie, that was brilliant.
So next up we have Georgina Edwards, who's a PhD student at Aston University. So take it away.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Hope everyone can see that okay. So I'm Georgina Edwards. I'm a PhD student at Aston, as has already been said. And today I'm going to talk to you about the correlates of anxiety in autistic individuals with moderate to profound intellectual disability, or those who speak few or no words. So we know that autistic people are at heightened risk of experiencing anxiety, and studies have seemed to consistently find prevalence rates of around 40% for autistic children and adolescents. However, the majority of autism research more generally has focused on individuals who do not have an intellectual disability, or those who may speak in sentences, with a recent meta-analysis indicating that 94% of autistic participants did not have an intellectual disability, and only 2% spoke few or no words. So clearly there are subgroups within the autism population that are currently being really underrepresented in the research literature to date. However, one fairly recent meta-analysis did include analysis to look at autistic participants with and without an intellectual disability, and they did explore prevalence rates of anxiety. They found lifetime diagnosis prevalence rates for any anxiety disorder at 42%, and when they looked at current anxiety disorder, they found prevalence rates of around 20%. These rates are still higher than for those with intellectual disability alone, suggesting that an additional diagnosis of autism may make an individual particularly vulnerable to experiencing anxiety. Research has started to look at correlates of anxiety and factors that may be associated with anxiety in the autism population. And two particular factors are sensory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour. However, again, the majority of the research here has focused on individuals who do not have an intellectual disability, or those who may have more verbal ability and may speak in sentences. This area of research is really crucial because being able to identify these factors that may be implicated in the development of anxiety may help us to identify those individuals who are more at risk than others, and also with the identification of factors may allow us to think about early and targeted intervention to support individuals. It's also a really crucial area of research because it's been identified by autistic individuals themselves, their families, professionals, as outlined in the James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnerships in 2016, where you can see here I've highlighted just a few of the top 10 priorities that are relevant for this area. So number one, stresses the importance of improving mental health via intervention. At priority 4, there's a specific focus on anxiety and reducing anxiety via intervention. And then at priority 9 was a specific focus on furthering understanding around sensory processing. So bringing those three priorities together highlights just how important this area of research is. So the aim of the current study was to do exactly that, so to explore relationships between anxiety, particularly for this study, auditory sensory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour in this population. So the current study is an online questionnaire study, and we've recruited parents and carers via a number of sources, so including the Autistica Discover Network, existing databases at Aston University and the University of Birmingham, via social media and via word of mouth. At the moment, we've had 55 parents and carers complete the questionnaire who are eligible for this particular part of the study, with the majority of those being mothers with a mean age of 59 years old. They have been parents and carers to 55 autistic individuals, where we also had 29 that had a diagnosis of a rare genetic syndrome. We had 36 males and 19 females with a mean age of 19.5 years old. 96% of parents and carers reported that their child or the person they care for had a diagnosis of an intellectual disability. As part of the questionnaire battery, parents and carers completed the Wessex Questionnaire, which gives us an idea about an individual's level of language and also their levels of adaptive ability. And as you can see here, the majority of the sample were characterised as speaking odd words only or never a word by their parent or carer. In terms of adaptive ability, the majority of the sample were characterised as being partly able or not able by their parent or carer. And to be characterised into these two categories of partly able or not able indicates that an individual needs some support with daily living skills, such as feeding, dressing, or washing. Parents and carers also completed the social communication questionnaire to explore autism characteristics. The authors for this particular questionnaire suggest a cutoff of 15 for autism spectrum conditions and a cutoff of 20 for autism. And as you can see here, the mean for our sample exceeded that top cutoff on that questionnaire. As part of the online questionnaire study, parents and carers also completed a range of other questionnaires, including the anxiety, depression and mood scale. And this particular questionnaire explores a number of different mental health difficulties, but for the aim of this presentation, I'm going to specifically focus on generalised anxiety. The sensory profile was used to explore different domains of sensory processing difficulties, but again, for the reason for this presentation, I'm going to focus on auditory processing difficulties. The repetitive behaviour questionnaire was used to explore repetitive behaviour, and the anxiety triggers questionnaire was used to ask parents about particular triggers that their child or the person they care for may be particularly relevant for that individual. And some of the examples on that questionnaire include changes to routine, animals, and crowds. So firstly, in terms of our results, we ran correlation analyses, firstly to explore the relationship between the variables. And as you can see here, when we focused on the subscale of generalised anxiety, we found that both auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour were significantly and positively correlated with generalised anxiety. We found a very similar pattern when we considered the total number of anxiety triggers that were endorsed by parents or carers on the anxiety triggers questionnaire, whereby again, both auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour were significantly and positively correlated with the total number of anxiety triggers. And then we looked at these relationships in a bit more depth using a regression analysis. Now, in this type of regression that we used, it was a hierarchical regression where we were able to explore variables that we thought may also be associated with anxiety, and being able to explore those additional variables make us a bit more confident about the contribution that auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour may have on anxiety. So for our particular example, we decided to include age, adaptive ability and autism characteristics as those other variables of interest. And then in step 2 of our model, we entered the variables of interest, so auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour. Now, when we focused on the generalised anxiety model, we found that 40% of the variation in the generalised anxiety scores were associated with all of those 5 predictor variables in the blue ovals there. When we did adjust for the factors we thought may be associated with anxiety as well, so age, adaptive ability, and autism characteristics, we found that nearly 25% of the variation in the generalised anxiety scores were associated with particularly auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour. Both of those steps in that particular model were statistically significant in being associated with generalised anxiety. When we considered the next model, where we explored the total number of anxiety triggers endorsed by a parent or carer, we found a very similar pattern, but with a little less of the variation explained by the factors that we explored. So 37% of the variation in the number of anxiety triggers were associated with all of those 5 predictor variables. And when we did adjust for age, adaptive ability, and autism characteristics, we found that 20.5% of the variation in the total number of anxiety triggers were associated with difficulties with auditory processing and repetitive behaviour. Again, both of the steps in that model were statistically significant in being associated with the total number of anxiety triggers that a parent or carer endorsed for their child or the person they care for. So, in conclusion, the current study has suggested that auditory processing difficulties and repetitive behaviour are associated with generalised anxiety and the total number of anxiety triggers in this particular population. These findings seem to be consistent with the research that has been done that has included autistic individuals who do not have an intellectual disability or those who may speak in sentences, which does lead to suggestion that the factors that may be associated with anxiety may be relevant across the autism population. It's important to note that the current study is cross-sectional data, and so we are unable to draw any conclusions about the directionality or causality of the relationships. So it may well be that sensory processing difficulties lead to more anxiety, but it also could be the other way around, whereby anxiety may lead to more sensory processing difficulties. We would need more longitudinal data to be able to tease that apart a bit more. The study has also relied on questionnaire parent report data, and we know of the importance of multi-method assessment when we explore anxiety and autism. But the next stage of this research project is to complete direct assessments with autistic individuals themselves and to explore these factors in more depth, so sensory processing, anxiety, and autism characteristics. I just want to go back to highlight the importance of this area of research in terms of thinking back to that priority 9 on the James Lind Alliance. So this want to further understand sensory processing. This was also a point that was particularly raised by parents and carers in a previous study, which was an interview study, whereby many parents did talk about the want to understand the sensory needs of their child and how that may be linked to the anxiety that they experience. And lastly, just to highlight again the fact that being able to identify these factors that may be associated with anxiety may help us to think about the pathways to anxiety, which will help us to think about how we may be able to intervene via intervention and improve long-term outcomes for autistic people. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you to all of our families who have taken the time to take part in our study. We are still recruiting for this study as it's part of a questionnaire development study. So every parent or carer will receive a £5 voucher for their participation. But at the moment, as I've stressed is so important in this presentation, at the moment we are just asking parents and carers of autistic individuals who have a diagnosis of a moderate to profound intellectual disability, or parents and carers of an autistic individual who speaks few or no words. So if anyone would like to find out more or take part in the study, please do contact me at the email address here on the screen. We'd really love to hear from as many families as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Georgina. That was brilliant. Just as a note, we're running out slightly ahead of time, but that's good because we've got a Q&A session coming up after our next speaker. So it just gives us a bit more time for questions, and then we'll start after the tea break back on track. So yeah, and just a reminder to use the Q&A button to submit any questions you have, which seems to be happening quite well. Got a lot of questions coming in. So our next speaker is Jane Goodwin, who is a research associate at Newcastle University. And Jane, you're speaking on the parent mediated group program, Coping with Uncertainty in Everyday Situations, cues, and whether that's acceptable and feasible. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll just check that that screen's gone up properly.
Yeah, we can see that.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about a study that's being led by Professor Jackie Rogers at Newcastle University. And I'll speed through some stuff at the beginning to get to our results, but please do contact us with any questions if I go too fast. So as was mentioned in Georgina's presentation, anxiety is really common in autistic people. So estimates range between 22% to 84% of autistic children experiencing anxiety, and 35% to 77% of autistic adults experience anxiety. And also, as Georgina outlined in her presentation, in the James Lind Alliance Autistica Priority Setting Partnership, in the top 10 priorities, anxiety and mental health came up. So the number one priority was which interventions improve mental health or reduce mental health problems in autistic people. And then number 4 was what interventions reduce anxiety in autistic people. So the study I'm talking about today addresses both number 1 and number 4 of those priorities. So intolerance of uncertainty is a mechanism that underlies a lot of anxiety. And what intolerance of uncertainty is how individuals perceive information in uncertain or ambiguous situations. So things like not knowing which teacher's going to be at school that day, or which friends will be at the swimming pool for the swimming lesson, or which team's going to win the football match on the weekend. And there's an assumption that that uncertainty is really stressful and upsetting, and they should really be avoided at all costs. So as I mentioned, intolerance of uncertainty seems to be a really important mechanism in both the development and maintenance of anxiety in both autistic children and autistic adults. And some work from the team at Newcastle has found that intolerance of uncertainty is recognisable to parents of autistic children. So things like when they look at situations that make their child anxious, they can identify what the uncertainty is and why it makes their child anxious. And also intolerance of uncertainty is associated with anxiety and repetitive behaviours in autistic adults. So, for example, if you're really, really worried about something, you might engage more in those repetitive behaviours to help yourself feel a bit better. To address this intolerance of uncertainty, Jackie and the team at Newcastle developed a program called Coping with Uncertainty in Everyday Situations, or CUES for short. And it was a program developed with clinicians and parents and researchers to try and find strategies to help manage that intolerance of uncertainty in autistic children. So basically the principles of this program called CUES is to tackle the mechanism, so tackling that intolerance of uncertainty. So instead of looking at something like social anxiety or separation anxiety, it's looking at all kinds of anxiety with an element of uncertainty in them. And it's a parent-mediated group, so the parents come to a group and they learn strategies to help their child manage that uncertainty. And it's group-based and it's developmentally appropriate. So there's different strategies and different ways of working with kids at different ages and stages. So CUES is an 8-session program, and each session is 2 hours. And I've just put up there what each session entails. So basically it starts with a general getting to know you and learning about what uncertainty is and how it relates to autism. And then there's different strategies that the parents learn about each week. And then it ends with sort of a revision of those concepts and looking forward to the future about managing uncertainty as a child grows and develops, and you know how you're going to manage things without checking in with a peer group every week. So CUES aims to develop the young person's autonomy through the promotion of flexibility and tolerance to uncertainty. So basically it's helping the child to be more able to manage that uncertainty rather than attempting to remove all uncertainty from a situation. Because as we all know, life is full of uncertainties, and even with the best planning, sometimes things don't always go to plan. So CUES also helps identify less helpful strategies that maintain that intolerance of uncertainty, and reducing their usage by providing other ways of managing that uncertainty. And it also promotes reflection and evaluation, so looking at situations that have gone well or not so well and learning about what we can take from that. Is there things to improve? Are there things that we can take for next time? And then what we did in the study that I'm going to talk about today is look at whether CUES was feasible to deliver through NHS services and whether it's acceptable and well received by families. So you can read more about it in the publication I've put up the top of my slide there, but I won't go through everything, just otherwise I'll have you here all day. But it is an open access publication. So we had 50 caregivers recruited to the study through clinical services, and they were mostly mothers that took part. And they had a child aged between 6 to 16 years of age. The average age was about 10 years. And we had 34 males, 16 females. And all the children had a diagnosis of autism and were experiencing anxiety. So parents were randomly allocated to receive CUES, which is a program I was just talking about, or a group called Understanding Autism, which I won't go into today for the sake of time, but basically it was 2 2-hour sessions about social interaction and communication and friendships, but not touching on intolerance of uncertainty. So after completing the program, whether it was CUES or Understanding Autism, parents completed an interview about their experience of taking part. And we looked at those answers and looked at and analysed them thematically. And I did just want to say that we have lots of results coming in. We've finished all the follow-ups for our participants now, and we will present them another time, but we just haven't quite had enough time to analyse those results yet. So firstly, I'll just quickly talk about feasibility. So in terms of information about the study, which I've labelled packs there, so we gave over 400 packs out to clinical services, which just explained about what the study was and had a form for people to return if they were interested in taking part or had any questions. And unfortunately, we couldn't quite keep track of how many packs were actually given out, but we did give about 400 to services. And then we got 80 forms back to say that people were interested in taking part in the study. Then 53 people signed up to the study. 3 ended up withdrawing just because life is very busy. So we ended up with a 50-50 split. So we had 25 parents take part in the CUES study and 25 take part in the Understanding Autism group. And in terms of attendance, we had 60% of Q's parents attend at least 80% of the sessions. That's a bit of a tongue twister, but basically the majority of parents attended the majority of the Q's sessions. And we do have the information about the Understanding Autism group, but I'm just going to focus on the Q's group today. And then in terms of retention, 86% of the Q's group completed their final follow-up. So that was 6 months after they'd taken part in their 8-week group. So we were quite pleased with how many people were willing to stay on board for the whole study. In terms of the therapy, we had 5 services that were taking part and handing out those packs to families who might be interested in the study. And around 20 therapists were trained in the Q's program, so they were able to deliver it in their own service. And we ended up having 8 therapists deliver the program for our study. And we had all different kinds of therapists involved. So we had some nurses, we had some clinical psychologists, we had some assistant psychologists, we had a real mix of people taking part. And in terms of the fidelity, so that means was the program run as it was meant to be run, where we've got the results, but due to coronavirus, we haven't been able to look at those results yet. So again, we'll feed back to you when we've got that information all analysed. Then in terms of acceptability, we did interviews with all the parents who took part in the group. So we had 25 parents in the Q's group, 25 parents in the Understanding Autism group, and then we had 8 Q's therapists. And we completed acceptability interviews with as many of those as we could. I'm just going to focus on the Q's group today. And we got 19 out of the 25 parents to complete their interview. 4 parents didn't attend their group, so we couldn't find out whether they thought it was acceptable. And then 2 parents didn't respond when we were contacting them about the interview. So we asked about different areas of Q. So we asked about the therapy, so the program itself. We asked about the research aspect of it. And then we also asked about the impact just in general life of the Q's program. So I'm just going to go through each one of those. So in terms of therapy, there were some positives and some not so positive aspects. So one of the difficult things was that it was really hard to find the venue, which we are very hidden away and behind lots of twists and turns, which obviously is very stressful to try and find when you want to attend a group. There was some work between the sessions, and sometimes people forgot to do the work or just didn't have enough time to do the work. There was also a few parents who took part in the study whose child was diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and they felt that sometimes the anxieties that the parents of children without intellectual disability had, so their worries maybe about fitting in at school or completing an essay for their English class, for example, weren't the same kind of worries that their child experienced. So it might have been more beneficial for them to be in a group together so they could talk about worries together that their children experience. Some of the positives though was that people really appreciated the advice from different experts, so other parents and other therapists. They found the group really enjoyable and useful in lots of different ways. It helped them to learn a lot about intolerance of uncertainty, which many of the parents said that they hadn't actually thought of as being related to anxiety before. And the group also made them feel less alone, which was really positive that they had some peer support there to help them with those really hard times that just come in life. So moving on to research, people found that Some of the things associated with research. So we did a big lot of questionnaires with the families before they took part in their group, including a really long anxiety interview. And a lot of the parents hadn't realised before that a lot of the behaviours their child was showing were because of anxiety. And because some of them hadn't thought about intolerance of uncertainty before, they found it difficult to identify situations that had a lot of intolerance of uncertainty in them. And something as well, some of the parents felt quite guilty after learning about intolerance of uncertainty because they felt like they hadn't even thought of that, or they hadn't realised the behaviours were due to anxiety, and they felt bad thinking like, maybe I could have done more, I wish I could have supported my child in other ways, which, you know, of course is a horrible feeling to feel. But then on the positive side, they felt like doing the questionnaires wasn't too bad, which is very generous of them because everyone was very generous with their time. They found the information about the study helpful as well. And they found it also an opportunity to think and reflect and have a think about what did the anxiety look like, how could they support that, and what tools did they need. So it was a positive experience in a lot of ways to do the research as well. Then in terms of impact, the parents felt better equipped after taking part in the Q's group, but they also felt like it was a long burner. So they felt like their children will probably always be a bit prone to worry, and those worries might change with their child's age and stage. And so they were just thinking, yes, we feel more confident now, but there's a long way to go in life. But then there were lots of positive things. So families felt like they were managing a lot better after doing the Q's group. Quite a few of the parents made sure they made time for themselves after taking part in the group, because they realised if they looked after themselves, they'd be able to support their family a bit better. They felt like the parents felt like strategies that they learned about in the Q's group had helped. And they also felt like now they could identify situations with high intolerance of uncertainty. So if an event was coming up, they could identify what might make their child worried about that situation in terms of uncertainty. So 100% of the people that we interviewed about the Q's program would recommend the program for all parents. And I've put some comments there. So parents have said it was brilliant. They felt like it was a great group, a great course. And they'd actually kept in touch with their group beyond the course, just to have that peer support. They'd been spreading the word about Q's, and one parent in particular said, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, it's changed my life. So just to summarise that, the data support the acceptability and feasibility of Q's, but there are some suggestions for improvements from parents and therapists. And the findings indicate a potential way to change and expand the way that anxiety interventions are delivered within the NHS. And just to say a huge, huge thank you to all the families who took part and gave up their time. The Parents Steering Committee who guided and advised us throughout. Also Autistica for funding the study, and also the Cumbria, Northumberland, Tyne and Wear NHS Foundation Trust for sponsoring the study. And I know there's a Q&A section, but we've also got our emails there in case you've got any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for that. That was brilliant. Right, now we're going to move on to the Q&A section. So Jane, you keep your camera on, and then if Katie and Georgina, you want to turn your cameras on too. Just wait for Katie. So what we'll do is we'll ask a question. I've got a group question to ask you all first, and then we'll kind of go through the Q&A and take turns asking you different questions that have come in from different people. Katie, are you okay to turn your camera on? Okay, that's fine. We'll start with you two then, and then we'll add in Katie once she joins us. So the question I was going to ask is one we asked this morning, got some really interesting answers back, is basically how did you kind of come to sort of be doing your research topic and researching autistic people in the first place? What was kind of the journey that led you there? So Jane, do you want to answer first?
I have to confess, I fell into it a little bit. So my background is in psychology, so I've always been interested in mental health. And then for my PhD, I looked at different genetic conditions, and a lot of the children with the genetic conditions I looked at experienced anxiety and were more likely to have a diagnosis of autism as well. And so then when the opportunity came up to work with Jackie at Newcastle, I applied, and then I want to stay in it because it's been really inspirational to learn from so many people, and sort of as well frustration at so many autistic people having such a hard time, and the total unfairness of that. So hopefully with some more education and things that might change in the future. So yeah, I think that's my journey.
Georgina, what about you?
So I did my undergraduate degree in psychology, and then I had the opportunity to do an MSci, so integrated masters with a placement, where I did my placement at the Cerebral Centre for Neurodevelopmental Disorders at the University of Birmingham. So that's Professor Chris Oliver's team, and that's when I started when I met Dr. Jane Waite, who's now my supervisor. And I definitely went into that placement not knowing a lot about this area of research, but I loved my placement. The team at Birmingham, I think the commitment and passion sort of is infectious. So that's just what led me on to doing my PhD. But yeah, I love it, so.
Thank you. Katie, I don't know if you caught the question, but we're just asking kind of what was the path that led you to be doing the research you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, sorry about that, Beth, and my computer decided that was a great moment to freeze. I think it overheated. So I have some personal experience that influenced my decision, and I also work as a therapist with lots of autistic adults. And I pretty much everyone, I mean, the people seeking therapy, any person seeking therapy is likely to have experienced a large number of difficult life events, but particularly my autistic clients. So I was interested from that perspective as well.
Thank you very much. Freya, do you want to start off the Q&A from the community questions?
Hi, so quite a few people have asked for Georgina, for Jane, sorry, about kind of the process of cues becoming something that's readily available to the community, and when a child is diagnosed, making it something that people can access, and also what were the strategies that were recommended within cues?
So a part of this study was looking to see if it was appropriate for cues to be, sent out into the world, if I can phrase it that way. And I know that Jackie gets a lot of requests for cues to be used in different services and by different people. So I think it's in process. I think Jackie is thinking about making a decision about how and when that will happen, and making sure we have the best evidence to show that it works for people and it's appropriate and people are trained adequately to deliver it, and finding that balance between getting that evidence and also getting something out into the community that we think is really beneficial. So I think if people stay tuned, we do have a Twitter account. It's just @CuesStudy, CUES study, and we'll keep updated on there when it becomes available. And in terms of the strategies used in cues, there's quite a few different ones, and because I wasn't involved in the delivery, I can't speak for all the details of that, but I know there's different things such as using the things that the children are interested in to help them overcome their worries, doing a bit of education, so things like making a cartoon strip or making a movie or making different things like that to help the child manage those worries. And something else is, which I really like is, and I've done myself actually personally, is making a little wow board. So when things have gone well, making a board to remind yourself that, you know, you've done this before, you can do it again. So, you know, a souvenir from a picnic you went on, or a ribbon from your swimming event that you did, or a photo from a really good time that you had. So there's some of the techniques, but maybe if people could get in touch if they have more questions about that, because I'm definitely not an expert on that aspect of things.
Thank you. A question for Georgina. I think someone's asked you quite a similar question, Jane, so we'll go to you afterwards. Is just looking at how your research kind of works with people who are non-verbal, know a few words, few or no words, and also if there's any way of looking at self-expressing anxiety rather than relying on a parent and carer through other communication devices. So that's quite a long, jumbled version of the question.
Yeah, so yeah, our first two studies have focused on parent and carers' perspectives. But as I said in my presentation, the next stage of the research is looking to complete assessments with autistic individuals. Unfortunately, we had just started that before coronavirus happened. So there's likely to be a few changes on how we maybe deliver that, but definitely with the in keeping with conducting assessments with autistic individuals themselves. So yeah, there's definitely the next stages of the research will make sure to involve autistic individuals more and yeah, explore anxiety from their perspective instead of just relying on parent and carer report.
Thank you. And Jane, is this something you've kind of come across in your research or plan to extend to?
Absolutely. So we did have a couple of parents who took part in the study whose child had few or no words, and they had sort of mentioned that it was helpful, but it wasn't 100% appropriate. So Jackie and her team have developed a cues, it's called Cues 2 for parents have a child with few or no words or an intellectual disability. And also there's an adolescent version. So instead of parents coming to the group to learn these strategies, the teens or the adolescents come to the group to learn themselves. And there's plans in the future for a child direct delivery. So it's sort of, this is the start of things, and there's lots of things spinning off in the future.
And Katie, I'll just come to you. I don't know if it is relevant or whether it is something that you've kind of come across looking at less verbal autistic people in your work.
I haven't yet, no, but I'm aware of some research into PTSD in minimally verbal people. It's quite challenging because a lot of like behaviours of minimally verbal people are kind of put down to their autism, when actually stress and trauma might play a really big part. So there has been some research, but I've not looked at that demographic yet.
Just coming to Katie from some of the community questions, but also a bit of just me asking questions. There was a question earlier, but it's gone away, about how if so that we currently have this construct, I'm going to call it a construct, of borderline personality disorder, and people are becoming aware that it actually you know, complex PTSD might be a far more accurate diagnosis, but we also know that lots of people who are diagnosed with personality disorder may be autistic and have experienced trauma. So it was about concerns about the concept that there might be this shift in psychiatry to diagnosing complex PTSD, but still maybe missing the autism. I don't know that this is a question you can necessarily answer, but like, how do we overcome that? We still potentially might have diagnostic overshadowing.
Yeah, there's a complicated issue. I mean, I'm a big fan of so I'm kind of bad at censoring my opinions on the concept of BPD and how it affects people, including traumatized people and autistic people and other neurodivergent people. So from that perspective, I'm really glad that complex PTSD is coming in, because it will hopefully be a much more accurate diagnosis for a lot of people currently categorized as having a personality disorder. When it comes to, I think I answered the question, that's why it disappeared. I think from what I know, like autism assessment services vary a lot in how much they ask people about experience of trauma. So some don't really ask at all, and you have to kind of volunteer the information, and some ask a lot, and we use it to exclude a diagnosis of autism now, regardless of what else they think you might or might not have. So it probably won't change much from that perspective. It'll be kind of a bit postcode lottery-ish. But I mean, no one else has really looked at complex PTSD in autistic people, so I suspect lots more research will have to be done before assessment services pay much attention to it anyway.
I could go on and on about this, but I'm sure that,
Don't we all?
I can have a Twitter rant later. And coming back to Georgina, there was a I'm sorry, I keep getting you confused. Apologies. Coming back to Jane, second time, we're talking about the phrase intolerance of uncertainty, and that this is like a deficit based language rather than and about basically redefining that. For instance, we talk about executive functioning rather than executive dysfunction, and people describe their social preferences, how they choose, rather than talking about lack of social reciprocity and that kind of thing. And so basically kind of combining with another question, whether within your studies you've had input from autistic community about your use of language, be that about intolerance of uncertainty, or obviously there's always the person first language debate and similar.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really helpful comment to have. I know it's a term from the anxiety literature, and for this study, it hasn't come up with our steering committee or the autistic people working on the study, but I think it is something that can be really jarring. So I think that's something that we'll definitely have to think about in the future, and sort of work with different members of the autism community to try and find a term that's sort of suits everyone, or most people, if we can't find a term that suits everyone.
I don't think you will find a term that suits everyone. I think any idea that there's like this homogenous agreement within the autistic community is unrealistic, because we're like there's a lot of us.
Yeah, absolutely, and everyone's got their own preference about everything, so it's not something that I think I can answer at the moment or give a term that I know that is acceptable to other people. I just know for our study, that's what we've used, and it didn't come up as an issue, but it's definitely something that I think we need to be aware of for future. So thank you for that comment. Thank you.
Well, we have another question for all of you. I mean, I noticed a couple of you touched on it briefly, but obviously another kind of slightly controversial topic is looking at gender difference in autism and whether that reflects kind of the autistic profile. But in your individual research, have you found any kind of gender differences in the way people present anxiety, depression, other mental health traits like that? Georgina, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, really good question. So in my study, we have got people included that have diagnosis of a rare genetic syndrome as well. So I think in terms of other studies I've seen, as our sample's been a bit more balanced in that aspect. However, this is only a preliminary study, ours is, and as I've already mentioned, that it is still ongoing with data collection, but that is definitely something when we've got the numbers to look at, to explore, yeah, whether anxiety does look a bit different maybe between, but no, it's definitely something we plan to do, but it's an ongoing study when we've got a few more numbers, I think, definitely.
Oh, thank you. Katie, what about you? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, Beth? And my laptop's still being a little bit temperamental.
No, not at all. So it's just what, I guess, pretty summarised. Have you seen any kind of gender difference in your research and presentation wise?
Oh, so I didn't get enough men participating in my research to have any kind of valid gender differences, really, but I'm interested in it. I think there's certainly a difference. I mean, studying mental health is a little bit tricky anyway, because there's such a stigma attached to men talking about their mental health, and I think trauma is quite a hard one as well. So I'm not particularly surprised by that, but I mean, I didn't find any, but I'd be interested to kind of look more closely in future if I could find other ways of recruiting more men.
Thank you. Jane, what about you?
It's similar for us. So the numbers that we had were quite small. Although I will say that a couple of parents who had either like male children or female children did mention to me that they found going to groups of parents of children of another gender weren't as helpful for them, because I felt like their child's reactions, maybe for example as a girl, were different to the reactions to anxiety they heard about from the boys. But again, we don't have the stats or anything on that from this study.
Thank you. Just another question from the community to all of you. It's probably quite a brief one too. It's just, do you expect that the level of anxiety about autism will be more related to internal or social factors with age? Katie, I'll go to you first.
Level of anxiety about autism.
Oh, I guess for autistic people, do you think anxiety becomes more internal or socially related as people get older?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that there's a lot of relevance to my research there. So I guess I'd imagine it would change as people got older. I would imagine that it would be more socially oriented for teenagers, because it's such an important part of teenagers' life. It's hard to escape, even if you're very introverted. So I'd imagine that it would get a little bit less socially oriented as you get older, but I'm just kind of like just kind of grasping at the dark there. So maybe someone else has a better answer.
Hi, and Georgina, what about you? Is that something you kind of come across or thought about in your work?
It's definitely something to think about, and I think would be interesting to explore. So one thing we did find, again, it's preliminary, so we'd need to confirm this, but we did seem to find that the younger our participants were, the actual more anxiety triggers the parent endorsed on the questionnaire, which I thought was interesting. As Katie just said, you might expect it to be the other way around. If as someone gets older, you might expect that they experience more anxiety, but in this case it did suggest there were more triggers that were relevant for the younger participants. So we haven't done anything more than that at this point, but I think it definitely would be interesting, especially using that questionnaire to explore anxiety triggers, what might be relevant for younger versus older participants, whether that changes over time. Yeah, is something I think would be really interesting to look at.
Thank you. And Jane, just to come to you, the same question.
I think it's similar. I think it's something helpful to have flags that we can have a look at with the data that we've collected. A general impression of the data from my experience, which again is preliminary and just off the top of my head, is that it just depends on the individual. So there were some teens that, you know, had extreme anxiety about social situations, and then there were other teens that just weren't that worried about social situations but had worries about other things, or they might have worries about the social aspect of things that aren't related to, you know, having a back and forth conversation or you know, doing the cool thing. It would be more like not knowing how to answer the open-ended question, more that kind of thing. But I think it's something that we should have a look at, definitely.
Thank you. Freya, we're just going to break. Do you have a final question you want to throw to someone, or should we leave it there? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
I'm just typing replies to some people.
That's great. I think then.
So I think, yeah, no, I think we're good as long as I can carry on typing.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. Well, thank you guys. So we're going to go on a 10-minute break now, which the Zoom thing itself is going to stay up and running. We're just going to turn off our cameras. So you got 10 minutes just to move about and wake up slightly, and then we'll come back with our final 4 speakers for this session. So thank you very much, and thank you hugely to Jane, Georgina and Katie for their fascinating talks.